Hi, my name is Tyler Moroniak, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Public Health at the University of Missouri, Columbia. I'm the lead author of this report, and below, as you can see, are the co-authors on this report from the University of Missouri, Columbia and the University of Missouri, Kansas City. This report's titled Barriers to Acquiring Funding for Organizations in the Ecosystem of Recovery. It was funded by a SAMHSA grant, as you can see, but it's important to note that the views expressed in written conference materials, publications, and by speakers or moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. The purpose of this quality improvement study was to identify barriers that the recovery community has experienced in acquiring funding from SAMHSA, states, and other sources. The second purpose was to provide the most comprehensive, broad needs assessment to date among organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. Just a bit of background. We use the term the ecosystem of recovery here, which may be a new term or unconventional to what many of you have previously seen or used. The ecosystem of recovery includes all organizations that provide recovery support, regardless of whether organizations meet the criteria for a recovery community organization. This includes recovery community centers, as you'll see RCCs listed throughout, peer recovery organizations, recovery housing, recovery high school and collegiate programs, recovery peer support, and recovery cafes, among others. There are 5 core pillars that establish the recovery ecosystem. This is to save lives, expand treatment, engage community, screen and prevent substance use disorder, and support recovery. How did we come up with this overall framework to take a look at barriers to acquiring funding? First off, we're building on a previous needs assessment. And the previous needs assessment, completed by a number of colleagues who are either authors here or on our subject matter expert panel, focused on programming needs for recovery community organizations. But here, the emphasis is on funding. That was one of the major issues that came out of the prior needs assessment. Was more work was needed to understand how there are severe limitations and restrictions on acquiring funding. Therefore, we asked, what makes funding difficult to get? And are there systemic disadvantages across various groups throughout the US? We chose to conduct a mixed methods analysis as we believe it offers the most insight into understanding these major issues. Therefore, we conducted survey and focus groups reflecting the expertise in our analytic team. Some of our team members have very strong quantitative methodological skills, some have very strong qualitative methodological skills, and some are very good at putting these two together in a nice synthesized way. That was our approach. Most importantly, when it comes to ethics and confidentiality, first and foremost, this is considered a quality improvement study, not big R scientific research, where we're testing hypotheses and looking to expand upon theoretical frameworks and things of that nature. The goal of this is to improve the opportunities and provide suggestions for organizations in the ecosystem of recovery to acquire funding and send this back to stakeholders and other policymakers. Participants in the organization still will not be identifiable in any presentations, reports, or publications. We are treating these data as if they are human subjects data, as if individuals participating were participating in any other study. We're taking the highest level of precautions to ensure anonymity, confidentiality. Next, I want to provide a brief overview of the quantitative methods, the survey. Surveys are really ideal for providing breadth in any study. You can acquire a lot of information fairly quickly with a lot of people who are involved. We created a survey that took about 10 minutes to complete online in a software platform called RedCap. We collected contact information first for 537 organizations in the ecosystem of recovery, which is in many ways a hidden population. There's no definitive list of all of the organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. We have some lists of recovery community organizations, recovery community centers, but also a lot of it's informal knowledge. And we relied heavily on our subject matter experts to delve into their networks to help us really expand this major list. Thus, because there isn't one organized list and there isn't really a known universe of such organizations, it's in many ways, like I say, a hidden population. In all, we covered a fair bit of geographic territory. This included 46 states, 3 territories, and the District of Columbia. In the end, 158 organizations in the ecosystem of recovery comprise our analytic sample, and individuals who were leaders within a given organization were responding on behalf of that organization. So the unit of analysis here is the actual organization, not the person. This 158 comes from 204 that started the survey but did not end up completing it. 48% of the organizations were identified as independent or freestanding recovery community organizations or recovery community centers. 21% were estimated the majority of their community members were people of color. And these two distinctions are really important for some of the main themes that came out in the end. For our quantitative analyses, we use very simple descriptive statistics. We don't make any inferences, in large part because this is not a representative sample, nor is it an entire population. We conducted all these analyses in the statistical software program Stata. We hope that the way we present these analyses, both here and in our report, are widely accessible and easy to read. We also, as mentioned earlier, employed qualitative methods by conducting focus groups. Focus groups provide the depth that surveys cannot. You can have more people talking at length about a variety of subjects in a very focused manner that you just simply cannot get information on in any sort of conventional survey. Our focus groups were 60 to 90-minute sessions, and we conducted 16 focus groups with 85 participants in total across those 16 focus groups who were recruited mostly through the survey. At the end of the survey, individuals were asked if they wanted to participate in a follow-up focus group, and those who did were eligible to be recruited for the focus groups. In addition, there were some who were unable to participate in the survey but wanted to participate in the focus groups as well. Inclusive representation was a key component of our overall sampling frame. 10 of the focus groups we conducted were by SAMHSA region. So getting the wide geographic cross-section was very important for that type of inclusivity. Further, we had 6 focus groups based on population identity as well. And these include what we called Black Voices, Asian American and Pacific Islanders, Native American and tribal communities, Latinx 1, which was in English, Latinx 2, which was in Spanish, and an LGBTQIA+ group as well. After collecting the focus group data, transcribing the data, our team as a group conducted a theme analysis and coded transcripts together in an iterative process until we came up with a consensus on the themes and sub-themes that were most pervasive throughout all of these data. We used the software program Atlas TI to do so. There are 4 major themes that you'll see in our report, and I'll briefly go over them here. We mix the survey information alongside the focus group information as well, here and in the report. The first theme was, they are so overwhelming, grant applications and the need for training. One of our survey questions was, has your organization ever applied for funding directly from a federal agency or department? And most notably was that 55% had said yes. Given that SAMHSA is a very large organization with a very robust funding stream, it's surprising to us that still just only over half had ever applied for funding directly from a federal agency or department. What we found in the survey, and this comes up too in the focus groups, was the complexity of SAMHSA applications was the top barrier to applying for federal funding. So the sheer complexity was the reason that we don't have a larger percentage of organizations applying for federal funding. And you can see here that in the 2 columns to the left, we break down the results by independent RCOs and RCCs and other peer organizations. Further on this theme, focus group participants indicated that detailed training and feedback would be beneficial. So one participant said in a focus group, I think I agree that the process is just really intense. And it's like, check all the boxes. And if you miss one box, you're not eligible, which can be very disheartening for someone who spent all that time writing these grants. But I think as far as the length of resources, there are people who are out there successfully writing grants and doing successful programs for SAMHSA. And I think it would be great if they would do like some trainings or some gatherings for other smaller agencies and other smaller communities to learn how to do this stuff. Another participant in another focus group said, I think the idea of training folks is nice, but that just takes time, and everyone who's already doing this work is already, working at max overcapacity. So I'd like to offer, if SAMHSA is willing to train folks, that this is actually a pipeline for people to get funding. If you go through the training, you're guaranteed some pot of money. That would really encourage a lot of small groups to apply. And it would also allow them to understand, what is the process like? And that'll also build their capacity for future applications and potentially bigger pockets of money. The second major theme we titled, and this is a direct quote from a participant, no amount of spaghetti suppers are going to raise 20 grand for an audit. Calls for fundamental changes to funding peer recovery services. Because of the bureaucracy and the mechanisms and the scrutiny that comes with federal funding, there are major concerns about the funds actually getting to the community level. Thus, local level bureaucracy was perceived as defeating the missions of organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. One participant in the group 6 focus group said, I do think sometimes the restrictions we have dishearten our case managers and support staff. It's like, what am I going to do? I'm not really helping this person. Like, you are, but you're restricted in what you can do. In the survey, participants were asked, does your state have a designated recovery support contacts that handles policy and funding matters? Most surprisingly, out of all of this, is that roughly a quarter of all organizations in the ecosystem of recovery who participated in this survey said that they did not know if their state had a designated recovery support contact that handles policy and funding matters. And often, with funds being channeled through the states, this is very, very important, and that a quarter of organizations don't even know if there is a person who they can talk to pick up the phone and inquire about funding opportunities. So we see this as a major issue. The third theme was my community is not invited to be a part of the conversation. The need for culturally inclusive funding approaches. Compared to organizations with majority white community members, fewer organizations with majority community members of color applied for state funding, so 17% less. Organizations with majority community members of color, 10% fewer believe their state SSA is helpful, and 13% fewer collaborated with other organizations regarding funding. So things that can all help in their own way acquiring more funding, it appears that there is some sort of disadvantage for organizations who serve the majority of their community members who are of color. From the Native American and tribal community listening circle, one participant said, Native Americans, we operate on the medicine wheel concept. They're split into four: spiritual, physical, mental, and emotional. But yet, how do you speak spiritual language and evidence-based practice? Let's say if I wanted to, like how I do before a lot of talks or whatever to calm myself down, I smudge. That's not evidence-based. If I'm stressed or worried and I jump in a sweat lodge and whatever like that and I come out, that's not evidence-based. Let's see here. Not only that, but the language that's used in some of these granting agencies, when I read RFPs, requests for proposals, talking about ex-con or addict or whatever, this is stigmatizing language coming straight from granting agencies. Sometimes I cringe when I'm reading some of these RFPs, and it's like I have to contort myself to this system if I want funding. A participant from the Latinx focus group, the second Latinx focus group, said, sometimes I'm included in the federal monitoring visits because sometimes they would come without a translator or other different factors. And I would say about 95% of our residents are Spanish speaking. Why, as of today's date, do we still have federal resources? That is a requirement. They should. If you're working with these residents, you should not be surprised when you show up speaking English and group participants feel intimidated because they don't speak the same language as that person. And the times when you do bring an interpreter or a translator, information goes missing. Information goes missing because of the translation, the words, the slang, and it's something they don't understand. It's not about translating a manual. It's not about having an interpreter. It's that you should not be the person that's visiting as the resource, because from your skin color to everything it's saying, the white folk is here to deal with the Hispanic, Latino, Boricua, and today's date, we have had situations in which we have had to point out, even during trainings, that we have in fact have Latino training resources, but because a person is North American, white, not Spanish speaking, we have to adapt the whole training because of that person. What message are we sending to the community? That one has to be white and English speaking to be productive. And it's really sad because it really strains that relationship. So powerful messages and discussions about inclusivity or lack thereof and the consequences that it has on organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. Our final major theme was keep the lights on, diversifying funding to sustain. Diversifying fund streams was essential to maintain operations. Organizations cannot rely solely on grant funding from any one level. 74% of the freestanding independent RCO RCCs had no federal funding, and this was 60% for other types of organizations. Thus, the remaining 25% or 26% and 40% comes from other sources. One of the suggestions was that a SAMHSA toolkit for how to approach municipalities and foundations for money would be useful. So if federal funding is very difficult to acquire, let alone apply for, having some potential toolkits or advice on how to approach smaller entities would be very helpful for a large chunk of the organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. When it comes to sustainability suggestions and risks, in some places, like Puerto Rico, there are few opportunities outside of federal funding, so it's risky to look beyond for help. In many ways, organizations in Puerto Rico have to hedge on acquiring federal funding and put all their resources to federal funding, even with the low chance of actually getting it, because there are very few options beyond that to keep the lights on. Further, time frame matters. Providers are in this for the long haul, as are those in recovery, and often granting mechanisms are for very short term rather than long term. But the reality is that the providers and those in recovery still remain in for the long haul, which means that continual risk and instability is at play for a large number of these organizations in the ecosystem of recovery. One participant in a focus group said, "It's great we can implement these services, but really got to do some work on the back end to make sure we can keep going after those 3 years. I'd love to see more of the 5-year timeframes for recovery services," speaking directly to that point. Prior to our overall conclusions, we came up with 4 policy recommendations. The first was to reduce the complexity of the grant process and provide training and technical assistance. This could include, and you can find greater detail in our policy recommendations in the report, this could include a recovery-focused grant writing series to maximize grant writing success, including how to identify grants that are a good fit for your organization to increase chances of success. But further, for those who are unsuccessful in their applications, getting feedback and additional training on how to improve upon grants for next time, their grant submissions for next time, would also be very valuable. Learning from mistakes to improve for the future and having that type of training would be valuable. Further, a central system for recovery organizations to apply for grants would be very valuable. Instead of having to put together a lot of the same material, a lot of the same non-substantive material over and over and over again for each new application. That takes up valuable time that leaders in the organizations in the ecosystem of recovery have little to devote to. So those are some of the policy recommendations for the first item. The second is opportunities to maximize the impact of funding for recovery organizations. This greater transparency in how states distribute federal dollars is one kind of smaller suggestion. How states issue block grants and more transparency around that process is also valuable. And going down to reviewing state regional data and prioritizing community needs would also be of great importance in order to pinpoint what types of funding would be most effective for various communities, both by geography, identity, or both. Third recommendation is to develop inclusive and culturally responsive funding approaches, as was one of the last themes. So engaging diverse community members to better understanding the gaps in mainstream funding is fairly obvious based on the quotations that I read through earlier and more within the report. Additionally, providing more support and prioritize grant funding for organizations that predominantly serve historically marginalized communities would also go a step in the right direction for this recommendation. Expanding the scope of funded services beyond those that are commonly called evidence-based to help ensure culturally responsive services are eligible to funding would help. And making sure that SAMHSA and state authorities have culturally responsive staff members and grant reviewers, both not only in the review process, but also in after the receiving the award or just being available for organizations in the ecosystem recovery that serve predominantly and historically marginalized communities. Lastly, the fourth policy recommendation to support expanded recovery services based on community needs and sustainability. One thing would be to streamline reporting requirements with upfront training and or templates to help reduce administrative burden. Provide small scale funding streams. Not everyone, sometimes the funding opportunities seem so large and with such large amounts that a lot of organizations in the ecosystem of recovery self-select out of even applying for that funding because they believe that they don't have a chance to acquire it. And also providing training on the importance of funding diversification in order to help organizations improve their overall viability and sustainability for the long term. In conclusion, the need for peer recovery supports and services will not subside, and unmet need remains. Freestanding independent RCOs and RCCs face considerable disadvantages in acquiring funding. Organizations serving BIPOC community members face multiple disadvantages in acquiring funding that most other organizations do not face, sheerly because of the needs of their community members. Efforts to do such noble work could be made considerably easier by addressing the major barriers to funding that we present here and following the policy recommendations that we've come up with. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out through the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. Follow us on social media, as you can see below, and we really look forward to any feedback you have, your continued work and participation in all of these efforts. Thank you so much.